Hi everyone, Michael with Bad Goblin Games. I want to talk to you a bit about how we are implementing the Tercio formation within Ages of Conflict. So the Tercio formation was not a formation that we had originally intended to add or to include in the game. We really had nothing with pike and shot early on in the game. We did have some requests to add it as we went on, and so you can't have pike and shot and not have Tercio, I think. So I think before I kind of get into the spiel of the formation and what have you, I think this is probably a good example for me as to our rules being, I'd say, simple and relative to other to mass war games, I should say, not maybe not others, but just mass war games in general. The reality with miniature games is that as you go to skirmish games, rules are typically a little more simple, and as you scale up to mass war games, the rules necessarily get a little more detailed. And usually that brings more complexity or difficulty. So one of our design goals with our game was to have a set of rules that are relatively simple, though do offer some hidden complexity in that we could introduce situations like the Tercio, which we did not account for at all in our original design, but we found we could offer it without changing any of the rules, without modifying any of the rules, without saying, okay, if you want to use a Tercio, here are the special rules that apply just to the Tercio. What we found as we were working through this is that the rules we had in place allowed for a Tercio formation to work perfectly fine without changing anything. So a little bit about the Tercio for those who aren't 100% familiar with it, and I'm not going to claim to be an expert with it, so hopefully what I'm saying is correct here. So the Tercio was a formation that existed within the pike and shot era, which itself was a fairly short era. I think I want to say early 1500s to early to mid 1500s to the late 1600s. So fairly short era, and in my opinion, the era and the formation represent a transition in warfare. So before all this came about, really you had what we think of like your standard medieval tactics. So you had your archers, your crossbowmen, you had your infantry, and you had your cavalry, and that's what you had. As that era came to a close and pike and shot kind of came in, you had the adoption of guns. Now, not great guns. We're not talking very effective guns, but guns nonetheless. Your arquebuses, your handguns. So early guns. Now, those guns did offer some advantages, though had some pretty significant disadvantages over your bows and crossbows too. And I think sometimes when we're talking about this stuff, you wonder how guns ever took over. So it's important to talk about that a little bit. So your bows and your crossbows had several, I think, significant advantages over these early guns. One was the range. I mean, they easily had at least twice the range. Actually, your bows and your crossbows easily had at least twice the range of these early guns. Your longbows, probably 200, 250 yards, whereas these early guns, we're talking about 100 yards. So fairly significant difference there. Rate of fire, bows, even if you discard the whole 12, letting loose 12 arrows per minute, which I don't believe was really a thing within warfare. To me, that's more of a theoretical rate of fire. But even if you discard that, your rate of fire with your bows was still significantly more than these guns. Heavy crossbows, I would say, had a better rate of fire. I wouldn't say it was significantly more, but it was better. However, where I'd say the reason guns became more and more adopted was one was firepower. Your bows and your crossbows, despite what we want to see depicted in Hollywood, weren't capable of reliably punching through armor, particularly heavy armor. That doesn't mean they wouldn't find a weak spot. That doesn't mean you wouldn't get a lucky glance or take down a horse that the rider's on. Doesn't mean they weren't effective. It just means that if you had a mass of archers shooting at a mass of heavily armored cavalry infantry, you're probably not doing as much as you really think you're doing. And the same thing for your heavy crossbows. Whereas these guns, they could really punch through that armor fairly easily. So that was one. The other, probably bigger reason, was simply they were easier to use. I could take, not me, but I would say, if you had a contemporary general at that time, they could probably take 1,000 new recruits and train them to use one of these guns much easier than they could a bow. Not that a bow is really complex to use, but it does take years of building up that string because you're mainly pulling back that string, right? Now crossbows didn't have that. They had that, they had the crank and what have you, so that wasn't relying upon pure strength to use. Though overall, I think guns really took over because of firepower and just how easy it was to train new recruits in comparison to, say, your bows and your heavy crossbows. That's probably why, in my opinion, guns became the prevalent infantry weapon on the battlefield. So you had guns becoming more and more prevalent on the battlefield. One of the major problems, though, is they really couldn't defend themselves. They didn't have bayonets. Bayonets didn't exist quite yet. So you had these gunners that had a really low rate of fire. So if they let loose a volley, they typically did not have time to reload and get off another round before the enemy was on top of them. So they needed some protection. And that's where the Tercio comes into play. So now you had these gunners, and they were paired up with a massive block or a square of pikes. So the gunners were there for the offensive part. They were there to shoot the enemy. The pikemen were there to protect the gunners. So if the gunners came under threat, they would retreat within the confines of those pikemen or to within the square for shelter. Now, historically, over time, the Tercio, it changed, it evolved. When it originally came about, it was a massive formation. I want to say around 3,000 soldiers. And the ratio was heavily in favor of pikes. You had about 60 to 70% pikemen, 20 to 30% gunners, and then you had a small number of halberdiers and swordsmen. Over the years, the halberdiers and the swordsmen disappeared completely, and the size of the unit began to shrink, and the ratio began to change. So at 3,000, that's a big unit, and to me, I think it probably got smaller just because it was probably difficult to manage. I mean, could you imagine trying to get 3,000 soldiers here to all understand what's expected of them? Now, I don't think the Tercios moved all that much once they were on the battlefield, but if you had to, I have to think it was just an extremely complex formation to get moving at a one time and to all achieve like a single purpose. So I think that's probably one reason why the size just shrank. I mean, you went from 3,000 to eventually down to 1,000, which is really the size that we see reflected within the black powder era, which is the next period, which was the period that followed pike and shot. So I think it was a natural evolution, and I mentioned this, the ratio changed. Originally 60 to 70% gunners, and 60 to 70% pikemen, and originally eventually that flipped. So you went from 60 to 70% pikemen, 20 to 30% gunners. That basically flipped to, say, 60 to 70% gunners, and then a small number of pikemen as these guns just became more and more prevalent. So sometimes I say the Tercio went away, and that's basically what happened. Though in reality, it really just evolved, and it had to evolve to keep up with the new linear tactics that were coming about. So you had some countries or armies that were still deploying a Tercio, albeit different from the original Tercio, but still a Tercio nonetheless. And now they're facing off against enemies that were starting to implement more of what we see in the black powder era, which is just your standard linear formation. So now you would have a tercio, and maybe it had 300 or 400 gunners who could effect fire at one time. And they're squaring off against a linear formation that's bringing 800 to 1,000 guns to bear at one time. So you could see that over time, the tercio had to evolve. It just could not bring the firepower, to bear against those evolving tactics. So that's enough of this somewhat quick introduction. I tend to talk too much sometimes, but let's kind of jump into how we implement the tercio within the game, and hopefully you agree that the rules that we have in place today work perfectly fine with the tercio without the need to introduce or change anything, any of our rules. All right, let's talk specifically about how to implement a tercio within Ages of Conflict. One of the design goals with our game was to offer a set of rules that were, I think, fairly simple, at least in regard to your mass war game rules. I mean, unfortunately, mass war games do tend to be on the more complex side of these miniature games. So we wanted to offer rules that were fairly simple, though we're also had some hidden complexity to them. What that really means for us is so we can introduce a situation, like a tercio, which we had no plans, I should say, to implement a tercio when we designed these rules. So the tercio was not even a thought for us. So I think bringing it out within the game is an example of having rules that are fairly simple that will allow you to implement or introduce new situations without having to redo the rules or invent, special circumstances or reinvent the wheel, whatever. So I think for us, this is a good example of our intention, coming to fruition in regard to our rules. So specifically, how to implement a tercio within the game. So this is an example of how we would probably represent a tercio. Now, yours can be a little bit larger than this, a little bit smaller, however you really want to design it. This is probably on the larger side. As I mentioned in the introduction, as the years went on, the size of the tercio did tend to get smaller. So this probably represents somewhere early to mid-use. That's probably what you see here. So we have 4 different units of gunners, I should say, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we have in the middle another unit of pikemen that are arranged in a square. So this is, if I'm putting a tercio on the table, this is how I'm probably representing it. Now the size may change a little bit, but this is basically what it's going to look like for me. Now there does seem to be some disagreement historically on how these pikemen operated. If they were a square, there's not an agreement on that, it seems, or if it was just a big block of pike. I tend to think they were a square because, again, this was, even though these are different tactical units, we're treating them as different tactical units, historically they operated really as a single combined unit. The gunners were the offensive part of the unit, and the pikes were the defensive part of the unit. So these pikes weren't going out and engaging the enemy separately. Their role was to protect the gunners, okay? And so to really do that, they had to be aware of what was going on. If they were all facing, this direction, then they, back here, they're not going to know what's going on with these gunners. They're probably not necessarily going to know what's going on with, the flanks or what have you. So I tend to be of the belief that this was probably a square, simply because that would give them better knowledge of what was going on all around them. And we do see the square implemented not too much later on. In the black powder era, we see the square really being used I'd see fairly extensively, particularly within the Napoleonic Wars. So this may have been the beginning or some of the early squares, and or example, like an early example of early usage of a square, if I can get the words out properly there. So that's how we're treating it. If you don't want to treat it as a square, that's perfectly fine. But that's when we're talking about how to implement the tertio within the confines of Ages of Conflict, we are treating this as a square. I mentioned they are treated as different tactical units within the game. So each of these would receive their own order. So we have 5 different orders going on here. Now in reality, these tertios, once they were on the battlefield, my line of thought is they probably tended to not move all that much. I think they probably established themselves and probably didn't move too much on the battlefield afterward. I mean, it's a pretty unwieldy formation or unwieldy unit. So my thought is they probably just didn't tend to move that much. Now you can move them if you want to. There's nothing that says you can't, though they in reality probably just didn't move all that often. So 5 different units, each receive their own individual order. Let's talk about the main crux of this, which is really how the gunners and the pikemen interacted when it came to offense and defense. So the gunners, again, they were the offensive part of the unit. So let's say we have these gunners here, and we have some incoming enemy cavalry. The gunners are going to let off a volley. The problem with the guns is that once they let off that volley, if it doesn't stop or phase that incoming enemy, they're not going to have enough time to get off a second volley before that enemy is on top of them. So they let off a shot, the enemy keeps on coming. As they're charging in, these gunners, they really only have 2 options available to them within the rules. They can either stand there and take the charge, in which case they're going to get annihilated, or they can perform a fallback, like basically a controlled retreat. So, and historically, that's probably how this really worked. So the gunners were threatened. They didn't just stand there and take it. That's the point of the pikes. So they would either move, say, back, maybe like underneath the pikes, maybe intermingle a little bit within the pikemen, or how I'm treating it, how we're really going to treat it is they would move backwards within the confines of that square. So now they're protected. They can't shoot out of that square, but they do have some protection now. And so now the cavalry, they have to decide if they're going to continue that charge, which probably wouldn't be a good idea, or if they are going to perform or if they're just going to halt the charge. So that's how that would work. And so incidentally, that's why it's important. You see I have these gunners, they're pretty close, to the pikemen. If you have them too far, even though I say, okay, they're going to fall back, they may not be able to make it there, right, to within that square. So you want to keep them pretty close to those pikes, simply so they can take that fallback and fall back to within that square. So that is really how the game, how it works within the confines of the game. They do receive separate orders, as I said. So if they want to shoot, we're talking second missiles, second missiles, second missiles, second missiles. The pikemen are probably just going to receive, forward orders because they're really not going to go anywhere. Their only role is to defend those gunners should the need arise. Let's talk a little bit about why the tercio evolved and just went away over time. I talked a little bit in the introduction about how the tercio evolved eventually. It was a massive unit, 3,000 soldiers, mostly pikemen, and then over time, the size of the unit shrunk down to maybe around 1,000, and also the number of gunners just kept increasing over time. So what when I say it went away, that's probably not really the best term to use. It probably just really evolved. And it evolved because it couldn't keep up with other tactics. So you had, at the same time, you had linear tactics coming more into play. So if I'm a Tercio here and I've got, say, 300 gunners that can shoot here, and I'm facing off against, an enemy, I'm just going to move up here. Let's say I'm facing off against an enemy that has, how many do I have here? I have 8. So this is 800 gunners as opposed to 300 here. They don't have the firepower to keep up. So over time, that's why you saw the number of gunners kept increasing, and eventually the Tercio really just, my thought is it really just evolved and slowly went away and adopted more of the line or linear formation that you see prevalent throughout the black powder era, which is really like the next era of warfare. So that's my feeling of probably what happened to it. And in game terms, if you have a Tercio formation and your opponent is using line or linear formations like this, you are going to get outshot. So that's just part of the disadvantage of this formation and why it eventually just kind of went away or evolved. All right, well, that's going to be it for our, a little video on how we implement the Tercio within Ages of Conflict. Hopefully you agree now that we've been through the intro and we've been through the specifics of how to utilize it. Hopefully you agree that the rules we have in place work perfectly fine. We don't need to change anything or adjust anything or give you any kind of special rules just for the Tercio, because we're really trying to stay away from some of that stuff. As always, if there's any questions or comments or suggestions, if you think there's something we could be doing better, we definitely welcome it. You can hit us up on our Facebook group. Just look for Ages of Conflict on Facebook. And if there's any questions, in this video, you can comment in the video below if you have any questions or suggestions also. Thanks.